G'day viewers. This episode is a follow-on from the previous episode in order to provide for people who seek entertainment rather than knowledge. In other words, some people don't like to listen to synthesized voices, so I shall be narrating this episode personally, despite the fact that it is physically uncomfortable for me to do so due to the permanent nerve cell damage in my lower legs. Please note that this episode denotes a condensation of the key attributes covered in the previous episode. In other words, this episode is a summary of the previous episode. We identified a scaling problem in episode 67 whereby we proposed that the BenchTop model built by Barry Castillio was constructed to half scale. Emeritus Professor Paul Edwin Potter states very clearly in his book titled Gravitational Manipulation of Domed Craft that Castillio had built the BenchTop AntiMatter Reactor utilised by Bob Lazar at S4. Please refer to section 12.3 on page 365 for the exact quotation. So then, an open question exists with respect to the scale that Barry Castillio's BenchTop model was constructed. That is, was it constructed to half scale or full scale? Moreover, we have confirmed that Bob Lazar's demonstration model was constructed to half scale. Therefore, doesn't it make sense that whomever constructed the demonstration model to half scale did so because they were replicating a half scale model they saw or knew about at S4? A full-scale model is neither cumbersome nor difficult to transport, so why would one build a half-scale model for demonstration purposes rather than a full-scale model? It appears that Bob Lazar has introduced confusion to the question of scale because he presented the half-scale model to audiences without clarifying the fact that the primary wedge demonstrated does not represent 223 grams. He neglected to mention that the 223 gram primary wedge mass related specifically to a full-scale model, not a half-scale model. As you can imagine, this leads to great confusion. At half scale, the primary wedge Lazar demonstrates could only have been 55.75 grams, that is, only 1/4 of the mass of a full-scale primary wedge. In addition to this, the scaling problem is compounded by the fact that the mass density of the primary wedge Bob Lazar endorses, that is 31.5 grams per centimetre cubed, simply cannot be the mass density of element 115. In other words, whatever material the primary wedge consisted of must have been some other element, possibly element 247. Please refer to episode 106 for more information. The primary wedge dimensional results we derive in this episode are in astonishing agreement with the dimensions provided to us by Bob Lazar via Project Gravitor leadership. Therefore, our electrogravity magnetic construct has validated Bob Lazar's dimensional claims with respect to the primary wedge. We have established that the electrogravity magnetic construct correctly determines the gravity A wave fundamental frequency and wavelength, the gravity B wave frequency, and the precise dimensions of the primary wedge, all from a single equation. Our determination of all these metrics have been indirectly confirmed by Bob Lazar, hence we have demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that we have a solid grasp of the physics associated with the sports model alien spacecraft. We showed in episode 67, as well as episode 108, that substantial incentive exists for research engineers to utilise half-scale models. Thus, given that we have a confirmed understanding of the physics associated with the sports model spacecraft, we insist that constructing a half-scale model of an antimatter reactor is entirely possible, and it is not limited by our understanding of the physics involved. If there are any limitations at all, they will be associated with our knowledge of alien material science, not the physics associated with the propulsion system. Thus, in the absence of any limiting reasons associated with the antimatter reactor materials of construction, we insist that Barry Castillio could have constructed a benchtop half-scale model of an antimatter reactor utilising conventional materials. In other words, we insist that the antimatter reactor did not require space alien materials, rather, conventional materials could have been utilised. However, we assert the existence of two possibilities. Number one, if indeed the benchtop model utilised by Barry Castillio and Bob Lazar was at full scale, then we suggest that this occurred because it was simply easier to remove an existing antimatter reactor assembly from another spacecraft as opposed to fabricating a half-scale model. Or number 2, if indeed the benchtop model utilised by Barry Castillio and Bob Lazar could not have been constructed to half scale, then we suggest that Castillio and Lazar lacked the correct understanding of the physics governing the propulsion system and therefore would have been incapable of utilising conventional materials in order to construct a half scale model. Please consider that, as you will learn in the coming slides, we have been able to correctly determine the gravity A wave fundamental frequency and wavelength, the gravity B wave frequency, and the precise dimensions of the primary wedge, all from a single equation. Our determination of all these metrics have been indirectly confirmed by Bob Lazar. Hence, we have demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that we have a solid grasp of the physics associated with the sports model alien spacecraft. We have been able to determine all of these key design criteria at arm's length, based upon rumours, misinformation and transcripts. Hence, we insist that the electrogravity-magnetic construct interpretation of the antimatter reactor is valid and binding. Therefore, we insist that the BenchTop AntiMatter Reactor Model utilised by Castillio and Lazar could have been constructed to half scale utilising conventional materials. Okay, going forward, we shall assume that Bob Lazar utilised element 115 as claimed.
The key takeaways from the previous episode are as follows. Number 1. Element 115 acts as a quantum vacuum inhibitor which suppresses the Casimir effect. Hence, by suppressing the Casimir effect, space-time curvature is also suppressed. Storti argues that the Casimir effect varies with respect to gravitational environments. Please refer to the Storti 2011 publication, The Extraterrestrial Casimir Effect. Number 2. The sports model configuration researched and compiled by Emeritus Professor Paul Edwin Potter aligns astonishingly well with the 16-disc solution derived via the electrogravity-magnetic construct. Number 3. Emeritus Professor Paul Edwin Potter states that a minimum of 12 discs should be utilised in order to effectively amplify the gravity A wave. Potter obtained this information via testimonial transcripts from Bob Lazar interviews. Number 4. A benchtop model scaling problem exists, introduced by the standard nuclear physics theory mass density estimate derived by Burkhard Frick. This means that the Potter and Bale depiction of the primary wedge is a half-scale representation because the base radius is at half scale. Moreover, the benchtop model displayed on Ken Wright's website has been constructed to half scale and was owned by Bob Lazar. Number 5. We may reasonably assume that the benchtop model of the element 115 reactor developed by Barry Castillio must have been constructed at half scale. Why would Lazar use a half-scale model if a full-scale model is not difficult to produce, nor is it inconveniently large? Moreover, an obvious question needs to be asked. If a half-scale model was fabricated for Bob Lazar to utilise in demonstrations, doesn't it make sense that it would have been done because it replicated a half-scale model which existed at S4? Given that the element 115 reactor model owned by Bob Lazar was constructed to half scale, we know that the optimal 16-disc solution on the right-hand side of the slide is correct. Viewers should also understand that the solution allows for variations in the number of discs utilised to manufacture a primary wedge, as illustrated. However, Emeritus Professor Paul Edwin Potter asserts that a minimum of 12 discs should be utilised. This claim is echoed by the illustrations of the fuel wedge manufacturing process appearing on Ken Wright's website. As of the production date of this video presentation, the Project Gravitor website displays this image of Bob Lazar holding a primary wedge with a model of the element 115 reactor in the foreground. Given that Project Gravitor's objective is to accurately reproduce Bob Lazar's story in a visual sense, we may assume that Bob Lazar has endorsed the dimensions of the primary wedge appearing in the image. Hence, this image begs the question, what are the dimensions of the primary wedge? By magnifying the image and executing a set of relative measurements within the Apple Keynote environment, we may determine some impressively accurate dimensions. Assuming Storti's index finger width measurement of 17 mm is acceptably similar to Bob Lazar's index finger, we predict a primary wedge base length of 51 millimeters. When we compare this estimate to the 2R value, that is 52.41 millimeters, we confirm greater than 97.3% similarity between the base length of the primary wedge being held by Bob Lazar and the gravity A wave fundamental wavelength predicted via the electrogravity magnetic construct. Thus, utilising a primary wedge height to base length ratio of 1.2053, which was determined via relative measurements, we estimate that the height of the primary wedge being held by Bob Lazar is approximately 61.47 millimeters. Hence, the number of discs utilised to manufacture the primary wedge, as predicted by the electrogravity magnetic construct, is 9 to 10. Please refer to the simple calculation appearing on screen. The value of disc thickness equaling 6.55 millimeters is common to all scenarios. It is important for us to mention and for viewers to appreciate that since establishing our disc estimate, Project Gravitor leadership has confirmed via Bob Lazar that the primary wedge consists of 10 discs. So what does this mean? Well, it should be quite obvious. It means that the derivation of the gravity A wave fundamental wavelength and the derivation of the optimal 16-disc solution via the electrogravity magnetic construct have been implicitly validated by Bob Lazar. From Bob Lazar's implicit validation of the electrogravity magnetic construct, which we proved on the previous slide, we may represent ideal configurations in accordance with episodes 52 and 65. The key design principle on this slide is that the engineering solution is anchored to 1/4 R, that is, 1/4 of the gravity A wave fundamental wavelength. Thus, viewers should notice that the primary wedge thickness equals the disc thickness, which also equals 1/4 R, and in turn also equals 1/4 of the gravity A wave fundamental wavelength. Moreover, we have provided solutions pertaining to different isotopes of element 115. However, whichever isotope we choose to utilise going forward doesn't really matter too much. Okay, let's now investigate some less than ideal primary wedge solutions. Less than ideal refers to solutions whereby the primary wedge thickness does not equal 1/4 R, that is, the primary wedge thickness does not equal 1/4 of the gravity A wave fundamental wavelength. In these two scenarios, we are working with full-scale models, but have shifted away from anchoring all dimensions to 1/4 of the gravity A wave fundamental wavelength. Instead, we have allowed the thickness of the primary wedge to be specified on an ad hoc basis. In doing so, we obtain two configurations for disc thickness, which yield a primary wedge mass of 223 grams. One disc thickness result relates to the Burckhardt-Frick value of mass density for element 115 being 13.5 grams per centimetre cubed. The other disc thickness result relates to the value of mass density for element 115 endorsed by Bob Lazar, that is approximately 31.5 grams per centimetre cubed. The value of disc thickness appearing in scenario 10 agrees to 94% similarity with the Bob Lazar endorsed value revealed to us by Project Gravitor leadership. Please remember that the value of disc thickness shown is based upon a triangular prism approximation of the primary wedge, not its geometrically exact volume. Unfortunately, we are unable to share the precise Project Gravitor dimensional value revealed to us due to a governing confidentiality agreement. Before we leave this slide, we will emphasize that the utilization of the electrogravity magnetic construct in this video presentation validates the primary wedge configuration asserted by Bob Lazar. To finalize our position regarding the scaling problem, we will invoke four tranches of evidence. Number 1. In episode 45 at time index 2534, Bob Lazar states that his benchtop model reactor is constructed to half scale. Number 2. Joe Vananetti was a colleague of Bob Lazar and claimed that the half-scale model which Bob Lazar utilised for demonstration purposes was constructed by himself and others, possibly with the assistance of John Lear and Bob Lazar. Importantly, Joe Vananetti implies that neither himself, nor Bob Lazar, nor Barry Castillio had the ability to construct an element 115 reactor utilising conventional materials. This is an important inference which we will revisit shortly. Number 3. Emeritus Professor Paul Edwin Potter's book titled Gravitational Manipulation of Domed Craft states very clearly that Barry Castillio had built the benchtop element 115 reactor utilised by Bob Lazar at S4. Please refer to section 12.3 on page 365. Number 4. We showed in episode 67 as well as episode 108 that substantial incentive exists for research engineers to utilise half-scale models. So then, how do we reconcile the alleged assertions by Joe Vananetti with the verifiable statement made by Emeritus Professor Paul Edwin Potter? Joe Vananetti infers that Barry Castillio could not have constructed a half-scale model of an element 115 reactor, yet Emeritus Professor Paul Edwin Potter claims that one was built by Barry Castillio prior to Bob Lazar's arrival at S4. So, is there a middle ground? Well, we have established that the electrogravity magnetic construct correctly describes the gravity A wave fundamental frequency and wavelength, the gravity B wave frequency, and the precise dimensions of the element 115 primary wedge. Our determination of all these metrics have been indirectly confirmed by Bob Lazar. Hence, we have demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that we have a solid grasp of the physics associated with the sports model alien spacecraft. Considering this, we claim that constructing a half-scale model of an element 115 reactor is entirely possible, and it is not limited by our understanding of the physics involved. If there are any limitations at all, they will be associated with our knowledge of alien material science, not the physics associated with the propulsion system. Thus, in the absence of any limiting reasons associated with the element 115 reactor materials of construction, we insist that Barry Castillio could have constructed a benchtop half-scale model of an element 115 reactor utilising conventional materials. In other words, we insist that the element 115 reactor did not require space alien materials, rather conventional materials could have been utilised. However, we assert the existence of two possibilities. Number 1. If indeed the benchtop model utilised by Barry Castillio and Bob Lazar was at full scale, then we suggest that this occurred because it was simply easier to remove an existing element 115 reactor assembly from another spacecraft as opposed to fabricating a half-scale model. Number 2. If indeed the benchtop model utilised by Barry Castillio and Bob Lazar could not have been constructed to half scale, then we suggest that Castillio and Lazar lack the correct understanding of the physics governing the propulsion system and therefore would have been incapable of utilising conventional materials in order to construct a half scale model. Okay, let's now pull together the key points we have covered or discussed. Reducing our video presentation to its essence, we have directly or indirectly established the following 4 points. Number 1. The spreadsheet associated with the link appearing in the top right-hand corner of the screen contains 4 calculators. Calculator 1 is associated with the optimal 16-disc primary wedge solution. Calculator 2 utilises Calculator 1 as an input, but allows users to compute ad hoc primary wedge solutions. The key design principle embedded into the computational engine associated with calculators 1 and 2 is that the engineering solution is anchored to 1/4 of the gravity A wave fundamental wavelength. In the case of calculators 3 and 4, this constraint has been removed. However, it should be emphasized that calculators 3 and 4 have been configured utilizing a triangular prism approximation, not a volumetrically exact solution with respect to the primary wedge. Number 2. The primary wedge dimensional results we have derived are in astonishing agreement with the dimensions provided to us by Bob Lazar via Project Gravitor leadership. Therefore, our electrogravity magnetic construct has validated Bob Lazar's dimensional claims with respect to the primary wedge. Number 3. We have established that the most likely mass density value associated with the primary wedge is 31.5 grams per centimetre cubed. As per episode 106, we assert that Bob Lazar did not use element 115 at S4. He utilised an alternative element, possibly element 247 instead. Number 4. Given that we have a confirmed understanding of the physics associated with the sports model spacecraft, we insist that constructing a half-scale model of an antimatter reactor is entirely possible. Moreover, we assert that if indeed the benchtop model utilised by Barry Castillio and Bob Lazar was at full scale, then we suggest that this occurred because it was simply easier to remove an existing antimatter reactor assembly from another spacecraft as opposed to fabricating a half-scale model. Moreover, an obvious question needs to be asked. That is, if Joe Vananetti and others fabricated an antimatter reactor at half scale for Bob Lazar to utilise in demonstrations, doesn't it make sense that they would do this because they were replicating a half scale model they saw or knew about at S4? Okay, many thanks for your time. We hope you enjoyed the video presentation. If you have any questions or queries, please reach out to me via the email address appearing on the first slide.